We're in lesson 22, and I know that most of y'all for the last couple of months have been getting your lessons electronically from the website. If you need printed copies of any of the last 5 or 6 lessons, they're on the table in the foyer, and so that you can have a printed copy, or if you didn't print them all, you can get them for your notebooks. We're in the last section of Daniel, and we're in the last sections of Revelation regarding the times and epochs that lead us to the New Testament time. In Daniel 11 and 12, the first couple of verses, again, this is one of those cases where we wonder about the chapter divisions. The chapter divisions made in the 1100s by certainly very knowledgeable men who most of the time did a very good job of dividing up the Bible into its chapters, and then a couple hundred years later is divided up into its verses. I'm not sure that those fellows did quite as good a job, but in any case, really, chapters 10, 11, and 12 are a set. I don't know how I would have divided this. There's a couple of places I wish they hadn't divided it right there, but honestly, I don't really have a better schema for how to do it. But chapters 10, 11, and 12 of Daniel are a set. And because of that, and the importance of the things that are here, and as Matt mentioned in his prayer, God's obvious foretelling of history, which the foretelling of history teaches us one of two things, or if not the two together, God's certain knowledge of the history that would come. And I think the way he had such knowledge of the history that would come was that he exercises a good deal of control over it. And so this set of prophecies, really, well, one set, this prophecy set of these 3 chapters gives us a timeline, I think, that takes us all the way to 70 AD, which takes us all the way past the Gospel Age, or into the after the first generation of the Gospel Age, because I think AD 70's destruction of Jerusalem is most likely in chapter 12. And I think that Herod is also very likely at the very end of chapter 11. And so that takes us right into what we know of the New Testament times. And so we've said nearly every one of these lessons, I think it bears repeating, that period that we call Bible silence, the time between Malachi and the coming of John the Baptist. This is a period in which God was silent when it came to additional revelation. It's not a time that God was silent about it. It's a time where he was silent during it. And so a couple weeks ago I gave the illustration of taking your kids to a play. And you tell your kids before the play starts, look out for these key points. These things are going to happen in the play. It's going to be very important. Now, during the play, what do? You sit quietly and watch it happen. Now, just because I didn't talk during the play, does that mean I didn't know what was going to happen? No, especially if I'm the playwright. But he's silent, obviously, during the period, at least as far as written revelation. The book of Hebrews will tell us that he, in prior times, dealt with people and by way of visions and dreams and in various portions and various ways. King James very poetically talks about divers manners. Is it possible that during this period of what we call Bible silence, some people receive dreams, revelations, and other things from God that are not written down? That to me seems entirely possible. I don't know how likely it is, and since there's no record of it, I couldn't say that it happened. But there are a few times where it's recorded in secular sources that people say such things happened, and in a time where God did do some things like that, we can't completely discount it, but nothing is recorded by the pen of inspiration during the period. But Daniel is going to give us really just a blow-by-blow in great detail of the things that come. And so for the first time in the writing of this lesson book, we've broken the format, and we have a lesson that's more than 4 pages, because I just didn't know how to put it in 4 pages. It turns out I probably should have done that on the lesson where we summarized Ezekiel. I don't know if I could have done that justice in 4 pages. I doubt I did. I probably should have broken the format back in our Ezekiel lesson, but I wanted to keep to the format. But on this one, I just saw no way to keep to the format. So what we have is these visions of coming kingdoms. And in Daniel's 10, 11 and 12, what we have are these lessons, that God knew and controlled what the saints would face for generations to come. And so they would be sorely tested, just like it would mention in the prophecy of the 70 weeks back in chapter 9, where we kind of have an outline of this. Now we have the details. But God knew everything that the saints would face. Nothing would, Matt mentioned the prayer, nothing came as a surprise to God in this period. And I think we can rightly conclude he controls it based on other statements. Like Daniel 2, he establishes kings and kingdoms. Or Acts 17, he establishes times and epochs and the boundaries of people's habitations and what people are where and when. So God's knowledge, and by implication from other passages, certainly I think God's control. Also in this we'll find the Jewish struggles, we'll find victories, and interactions with world powers are described. And so when the Greeks come, well, the Jews would have to deal with that, and something of that is said. When the Romans come, the Jews will deal with that, and something of that is said. And that really is, becomes New Testament introduction, doesn't it? This period of Old Testament, Intertestament period, really becomes New Testament introduction. Because by the time we get to the end of this lesson, we'll already know something of Greek culture and language and Greek influence on the people of God in the Old Testament, and we'll find about Roman rule of God's people. And aren't those two major things in our understanding of the Gospels? And so we'll find that. And then also, the ultimate end is the victory of God's Messiah. And so the prophecy is that the Messiah will rule and the Messiah will reign in spite of these unbelievably powerful kingdoms that come. So these things are done. Now, last time we talked about the terrifying man and compared him to Jesus after the resurrection, the glorified Jesus in Revelation 1. And we also talked about this timeline, and the closer version of this timeline is in your study guide. But what we'll note is that these prophecies see the coming of Alexander the Great. That was in the year 322 BC. Then we also saw that he was there for just but a little while. And there were 4 who took over his kingdom, 2 of which are important to us. So you see 2 continuing lines from the Greek takeover after the fall of the Persian Empire. And we'll have the Ptolemies who rule in Egypt, and they rule all the way to 30 BC. You've heard of the Ptolemies. You've heard of Cleopatra. You've heard of Mark Antony. You've heard of the last of the Ptolemies' interactions with Julius Caesar, the Roman civil wars, and all those things. These are the same people that are in these prophecies. And then also the Seleucids, those rulers of the Greeks who ruled from Damascus. They ruled in what is now modern Syria, and at times the boundaries of their kingdoms moved in all different directions away from Damascus, and sometimes they controlled a massive chunk of territory, and other times they didn't control such a massive chunk of territory, but off and on they controlled Jerusalem. One of the other interesting facts about this Seleucid family is the general named Seleucus, which for whom the Seleucids are named, Seleucus, his father's name was Antiochus. And in the New Testament, how many cities do we run into that are named Antioch of some type or another? Well, why are all those cities named Antioch? Because this family named it after the patriarch of their family. And so we run into the remnants of these people all over the book of Acts, in city names, if nothing else. Then also on this timeline, at the bottom, you'll see the Roman Republic. Because the Romans, in the days of their republic, took over the lands of the Seleucids. They took over Damascus in 63, 64 BC. They took over Jerusalem at the same time. And so from 63 BC on, the Romans are in charge. And about 40 years after they take over, they change from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. You studied that in your world civilization class. And it's in the days of the Roman Empire, under some of their governors and under the Caesar Augustus, who's named, that Jesus is born. And then eventually, under the time of Caesar's, that Jesus does his ministry. And we'll run into Romans all over the gospel. And we'll run into Romans all over the book of Acts. And we'll mention them a lot of times in prison epistles and the like. And so really what we're doing is really bridging the gap in this section between the Old Testament times and the New Testament times. An additional thing of information that is important to us as far as the history is who's in control of Judea? Who rules Jerusalem? And so we think about the majority of the Old Testament period, who ruled in Jerusalem? Well, from the time of David on, the Jews did, right? And even from the time of Joshua on, they controlled the area around it, even if they didn't control that one particular stronghold, and there were pagans up in that one little city for a good while. But from the time of David on, which basically is 950, round number, from 950 BC, the Jews are in charge of Jerusalem. They were in charge of Judea for a couple hundred years before that. So round number, let's say, the year 1100. From the year 1100 on, the Jews were in control of Jerusalem until Nebuchadnezzar. And then we studied about him sending the people to captivity around the year 606, and he had taken over just a little before that. So round number, for 500 years, the Jews controlled Jerusalem. And then Jerusalem was controlled by these various other empires. First is controlled by the Babylonian Empire. Then Jerusalem was controlled by the Persian empires. They took over from the Babylonians. And then in the year 332, Alexander the Great gives the city over to the Greek control. So Alexander's empire, which was very short-lived, and then his generals and their four-part empire, but under Greek culture and language and dominance, the Greeks from the year 332 on are in charge of the city of Jerusalem. And then the Ptolemies, they more or less ruled from 301 down to 201. Now there's some times when the two Greek empires traded blows, and there's some short spans of time where it changes hands back and forth a lot. We're only talking about, in general, who controlled it most of the time. So for most of the time, for the first 100 years or 120 years of Greek control, Jerusalem is controlled by those up in Damascus, and then, controlled by those from Egypt. So it's Egypt, but it's ruled by Greek families. And then it's controlled by the Seleucids, the Greek family and their descendants of Alexander's general who ruled from Damascus. And the important ones of those are Antiochus III and Antiochus IV. And Antiochus III was a reasonably good leader, and he built the empire quite a bit. Antiochus IV is the one known as the Wicked One. He destroyed what his father built. And so he's so bad that the Jews revolt, and that's where you get Judas Maccabee. And for a little while, then, the land is in turmoil, but after the Maccabean revolt, the Jews have control on their own. And so after about 150, 160, again round numbers, of Greek control, the Jews have a 100-year period, or again round numbers, the Jews have about a 100-year period where they are in control, and they make their own empire. And boy, when they get their empire, like so many young empires, young and fresh and full of energy, they go on a conquering spree. They defeat the remnants of the Edomites, who are by then known as the Idumeans. Of course, when they take the Idumeans into their kingdom and the remnants of the Idumean people into their culture, who do they get? They get one particular family of Idumeans, a noble family, which produces a guy named Herod. And this is where Herod comes in. His family, the kind of political survivors, when their culture is crushed and their land is taken in by those in Jerusalem, his family ends up at the top of the social pile, and then he befriends the Romans. His family does, and Herod ends up becoming, the king of the Jews. Usually we think about Jesus as the king of the Jews, but early on, before the time of Jesus and before Jesus' ministry, the literal king of Jerusalem, the literal king of the Jews was Herod the Great. That was one of his titles, was king of the Jews. So not only that, when the Hasmoneans, the relatives of the Maccabees, when they took over and made their kingdom, they also conquered the Samaritans. So there had been a lot of conflict between the Jews and the Samaritans over the years. And the Jews, when they got their own kingdom, they conquered the Samaritans pretty easily, and they ruled them with an iron fist, and they really put their foot on their throat. And one of the things they made all the Samaritans do was clean up their pagan religion and make it more Jewish. And they got rid of a lot of their pagan vestiges. They still had their temple up in whatever town that was. Starts with a G, doesn't it? They argue about that in John 4, Jesus and the Samaritan woman, about where to go worship. But in any case, one of the other things that they made the Samaritans do was they made all the Samaritans get circumcised. And so that's one reason why when the Samaritans are first brought into the church in the book of Acts, there's no controversy about whether Samaritans can come to the church like Gentiles because they're already circumcised. Of course, how do you think the Samaritans felt about that? They didn't like it, and there was hard feelings for a long time. So we find in the gospel over and over, if you're walking to Jerusalem, you can't go through Samaria, can you? And that's where that animosity comes from. It comes from this time of Jewish rule. Also during this time of this Jewish rule, this family of the Judas Maccabee, Judas didn't have any sons that survived the revolt. One of the problems with revolting is maybe you and your sons don't survive. But a nephew of his took over, John Hyrcanus. And again, I don't know why the Maccabees are related to the Hyrcanus family, and history knows them as the Hasmonean Empire. I don't know why we got 3 separate names. It'd be easier if we just had one, but we do have 3. This John Hyrcanus, he sets himself up as king of Jerusalem, and also he makes his family to be the high priest. Well, there's only a couple of problems with that as far as the religious Jews are concerned, is which family should be the king in Jerusalem? The tribe of Judah, the lineage of David. That's who should be the king in Jerusalem. And who should be the high priest? The people of the tribe and lineage, the direct lineage of the former high priest. And these guys were priests, but they weren't descendants of the high priest. And so the people that objected to that, they said, you guys have taken too much power for yourselves. You guys are the wrong king, and you're the wrong priest. The people who organized around those 2 principles of objection, you know what we know them as? Pharisees. That's the start of the Pharisee party. The Pharisees object to this and say, you people shouldn't take this power on. And they said, no, we got the power, we like it, and we're going to be in charge. And so you have these Sadducees, these wealthy, politically connected, very secular-minded people in charge of Jewish society, which is religious. Of course, then there's some of them, once Herod takes over, what do they decide to do? He's in charge, let's be with him. And what do we call that party of people? The Herodians. In the scriptures, we have a party named the Herodians, don't we? And they're just kind of Sadducees on steroids. They're these people who are with the party in power. Well, lastly, since we've gone this far with it, we got 2 more groups. What about the people who in the future, when the Romans take over, there's a lot of Jews who say, hey, I liked it better when we had our own kingdom. Well, let's do that again. Let's have a Jewish kingdom, and we'll do it better this time. And what do we call those people? Zealots. And that's where we get the zealots. They say, we liked it when we were in charge around here. And we threw off the Greeks, and we can throw off the Romans. Of course, the Romans were a little bit different animal, weren't they, than the Greek Seleucids up from Antioch. Up from Damascus. They were a little different animal. They didn't get to throw them off. And then one more group, since we've done this far. What about the people who said, you know what? Pox on all your houses. We're just going to go live out in the desert, and we're going to live away from all this impurity, and we're going to, basically they lived like in a monastery type situation, where they had, strict devotion to religious learning and religious purity, and they're not actually mentioned in the scriptures, but we know them well from history. There's a group of people who went into the desert. What do we call them? The Essenes. And they're the people who left us the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so I find it interesting, the people who really dedicated themselves to scriptural knowledge and to moral purity and non-corruption of the world, they're the only ones who don't make it into the Gospels. I don't think the gospel intention is ever that we would draw from society and live off, where society can't get to us and can't get behind our walls. I just don't think, I think that's one of the lessons we can draw from that. Okay, so this control of Judea, every one of these things leaves legacies that are important for the New Testament times and for the story of the gospel in the New Testament church. Why is the language of the church, why is it Greek and not Hebrew? Well, because the Greeks were in charge and they taught everybody. Everybody learned Greek, nearly everybody. And there was a good translation of the Old Testament in Greek. And there were all these people all around when the gospel was spread who weren't Hebrews. And there's no way they're going to learn Hebrew. Are you guys going to learn Hebrew? No. We're not even going to learn Greek or Latin, much less Hebrew. But that's why everything's in Greek. And so just so many things, from the language to the culture to these political situations and these things left over of hard feelings and ambitions and desires and visions of what the kingdom ought to be. There's so many things of the gospel times that are rooted in this intertestament period. And Daniel tells us all about it. Daniel tells us about its coming and the things that'll be. So the history that is to come, in particular, in Daniel 11 and 12. So in Daniel 10, again, we had Daniel dealing with that one like the glorified Christ and the dealings with the things of the kingdom of Persia and the prince of Persia. And then in chapter 11, the prophecies of what would come, given, as it says in Daniel 11:1, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I stood up to strengthen and protect him. And he says, now I'll tell you the truth. 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and the fourth will be far richer than the others. Well, that sounds good. That sounds good for that empire, right? 3 more kings, and then comes a big old fourth one, who's kind of the bully boss. And the power he gains through riches, he will stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece. Now, depending on how your translation reads in that, either he'll stir up everybody against Greece, or maybe in some of these translations will tell us he stirs up Greece against him. Either way works. And this certainly, if you count the kings up, this seems to be the king that world history knows as Xerxes. Now, in Bible history, how do we know this guy? Ahasuerus, from the book of Esther. And so this great and powerful king, and we've already had other prophecies about the temper of this man and the power of this man in other places, but now he will get everything stirred up, this fourth king to come. Now, it'll be a while until the Greeks finally defeat all the Persians, but it's from his time on that there's this constant contest between the Greeks and the Persians. It says, then a warrior king will arise, and he will rule a vast realm and do what he wants. Now, this seems to be Alexander the Great, because it says, as soon as he's established in his kingdom, he'll be broken. It'll be broken up and divided into the 4 winds of heaven, but not to him or his descendants. So, the warrior king comes. The warrior king comes, and we're going to have the division into 4. Well, that's exactly the prophetic description of Alexander the Great, and a description of what happens when he comes. And who would have guessed when Alexander was at the height of his power that none of his children, none of his relatives would ever sit on his throne? But he died at a very young age. He died in his mid-30s. Now, he'd done a lot by then. He had come out of Macedonia, and he had unified Greece. And all those warring city-states that you study about in all your Greek history, he got all of them together in one mighty army, and they went through Asia Minor, which was a massive population area at the time, which is modern Turkey. He went through that without hardly any opposition at all. He went down by Tyre and Sidon, and just like the prophecies in Isaiah talk about the fall of those cities, he took them, and then he went to Jerusalem, and what did he do to Jerusalem? He spared it entirely. Josephus tells us that the priest in Jerusalem understood this was prophecy, and they dressed up in their finest robes, and they opened the gates of the city, and they all stood in front of the gates of the city with the priest, the high priest in his great finery, holding a copy of the scroll of Daniel, and said, "We knew you were coming because it's written right here." Now Josephus then goes on to tell us that Alexander said, "Well, I saw you guys dressed exactly like this in a dream not that long ago, and I could tell that it was a divine thing that I would come here." And so now anybody who's a skeptic at all doubts Josephus' story. But Josephus tells it with all the candor that he tells the rest of his history. And we know for a fact that Alexander didn't do a thing to Jerusalem and gave it a favored status. And so basically, after visiting there and being treated like an honored guest for a little while, he and his army went on refreshed and conquered Egypt pretty quickly. And then they came back through and went up and conquered Damascus, and then they went and conquered the rest of the Persian Empire. And then what did they do when they conquered the Persian Empire? They kept going until they got to India. And he conquered about a third of India. And finally his army said, maybe that's enough. We've been on the march for 10, 11 years now. Maybe we should enjoy ourselves. And Alexander didn't want to, but evidently he was convinced. And he went back to Damascus, and he ruled there like an oriental potentate for about a year, year and a half. And by that time he had 4 wives, and he had a good number of children. And you'd think, well, this is set up forever, isn't it? And then he dies of a fever. And history tells us that everybody for a few years is just in shock as to what to do, and there's general peace for several years. And there's some regions who try to rule in his place, and all of his wives try to get their children into a favored place to take over the thing. And various ambitious people to back various ones of the children and the families. And his mother, because she's still alive and a relatively young and vital woman at the time, his mother got involved. And eventually, though, it degenerates into a 4-way civil war. And every one of his relatives, all his children, all his wives, and his mother too, all of them got killed in the Civil War. And then his 4 generals, just as the prophecy says, they take over and they rule in 4 separate kingdoms. And so I wonder how Daniel knew that a couple hundred years in advance. That's exactly what happened, isn't it? The warrior king will arise. He will make a vast realm. He'll do whatever he wants. But as soon as he's established, his kingdom will be broken up and divided to the 4 winds of heaven, but not to his descendants. It will not be the same kingdom that he ruled, because his kingdom will be uprooted, and it will go to others beside them. And so then we start in the next part, and I'm going to, go to this. So we have in verse 5 down to verse 20, we have the story of 2 kings. We'll have the story of the king of the north and the story of the king of the south. And I think it's very fair and pretty obvious to identify them, the kings of the north, as the Seleucids who are in Damascus, and the Ptolemies as the kings of the south who ruled down in Egypt. And if you're in Jerusalem, from where the vantage point of this prophecy pretty well takes place, if you're in Jerusalem, what's north? Damascus. And if you're in Jerusalem, what's south? Egypt. And so we're going to have the king of the north and we're going to have the king of the south. And it seems to be, again, these dynasties, not particular individuals, although there's a number of times when these can, I think, be quite obviously identified as various historic individuals. And as I mentioned before a couple of weeks ago, when we see people today who go to the book of Revelation and they go to prophecies which they think are about the future, and they say, this is about this set of kingdoms. Like I remember when I was a young man and there were the 10 kings in the book of Revelation, and that was the European Union. Because at one time the European Union had just about 10 made countries in it. Now I think it's 23. I mean, just about anybody can get in the European Union, it seems like. Everybody wants in but the British. But anyway, when people make predictions like that and say, oh, this is this set of kingdoms, this is this alliance, this is these things, or, you know, Gog and Magog get identified with Russia and China and the like. When we see those prophecies, what do we often say? And we see those prophecies used in that way. What do we say? Oh, that's ridiculous. Now, I have to say, as we go through here next week in the king of the north and the king of the south, what are we going to do? We're going to identify them as kings and dynasties in particular cities, in particular years. And we're going to identify, and if you read ahead in your notes, you're going to see just how closely we identify this to some actual people who are historical figures. Now, when we see things like that, then does it make sense as to why people would try to apply prophecies that they think are future to literal kingdoms that are around now? It makes absolute sense. Now, I think that the basis of the whole interpretation system, and mostly its premillennial framework, I think there are some great fundamental flaws in that, and I think most of the prophecies that they look at as future are actually historical. And so I don't think at all they identify the right kingdoms, and I definitely don't think they're in the right times. But I think we can at least be sympathetic to the attempt, because it's done from an idea of that God, when we talk about God controlling the future for Daniel, which is our past, right? If we believe that God so controlled the past, do we believe that God can make a prophecy if there were prophets today, big if, but if there were prophets today, speaking by inspiration, could a prophet of today outline the future for the next 400, 500 years, if it's going to be that long? Could a prophet like that, could a prophet do that today if they had inspiration? I certainly believe they could, because who knows the future? God does. But, as I say, I don't think they're starting in the right place. I don't think that's how the Scripture handles things of the future for Christians. But, again, I think we might ought to be a little more sympathetic to the effort, not the result, but to the mindset and the effort. I think we should have some sympathy for these folks, because they certainly are believers in inspiration and the power of God, right? And so when you have people like that, I think it's best to treat them kindly and to try to instruct them into what God actually was saying, because God is giving mighty powerful predictions. But I don't think very often about our future, except in the final coming. But certainly there's powerful predictions about their future, our past. So God's control is seen in all of these things. All right, we'll talk about the king of the north, the king of the south, having set that framework for interpretation as we go forward.